Good afternoon, everyone. Um, I want to welcome all of you to what I think is going to be a very educational, perhaps challenging, perhaps controversial task. Um, and what I'm going to do right at the onset is ask people to mute themselves if they haven't done so, just to avoid the feedback. I'm Mayor Tom Barrett, and what I've assembled here is a group of individuals that I have asked to help us examine our pension system and the challenges that we face, the opportunities that are afforded to us. And I consider this to be one of the most important issues that this city faces right now and in the near future. We know that we have many challenges. We're trying to fight our way out of this pandemic. We're trying to get our economic house back in order. We're continuing the fight for racial justice and equality in our society and specifically in our community. And at the same time, we have to grapple with what I consider almost an existential threat to the fiscal future of this city, and that is our pension system. I'm not going to talk a lot about it because we've got several very, very good speakers here today who are going to go more in depth on this issue. But I want to welcome not only those individuals who have agreed to serve on this task force, but I want to thank those individuals who are watching as well. And just to give you sort of a little snapshot of where we hope to go. It is my hope that with this group, and we will be adding others, and I'll touch on that in a moment, that we will, by mid-August, be able to formulate different approaches that we could take. Not necessarily come to a consensus as to what the approach should be, but I think it's important for us to lay out different options, some of which will be internal, some of which may be external, most specifically, some which may involve the state and approval from the state legislature. And so I think the best way for us, though, to make best decisions is to have a very open and transparent discussion. So when we talked about this pension task force, one of the questions that came up immediately is, well, is this going to be open so that others can be watching and perhaps even getting involved in this? And I said, I want this to be open to the public. So I think we probably have dozens, if not hundreds of people who have signed up, who are either members of the system or will be members of the system. And I want us to be transparent in what we are going to be doing and how we're going to try to address this. We can continue to deliver the service that our residents expect, and but at the same time, make sure that we're fair to those individuals who have given us service as employees of the city. So there's a lot of work to be done. I've asked Antonio Riley to chair this. He is at a funeral, I believe, right now, so he is going to be joining us later on. Jomar Hooper I'll be turning it over to him after I first introduce Molly King for a couple of housekeeping matters and just to let people know how things are going. The other key person on this call is Alexis Peterson from my staff. Aaron Sopinski, also from my staff, will be joining us next week. He is out of pocket today, but he is involved in this also. A couple of points before we move on. As we put this together, I realize that this is a lot of work. And I realize, again, this can be challenging. And so I reached out to people who have a history of working, trying to find solutions to problems. One group that we did not include, and we are going to change that immediately, is a formal representative of the retiree group. We have several individuals who are retirees who are on this task force, most notably Mark Nicolini. But when individuals pointed out that we don't have an actual person representing the Milwaukee Retirees Association, I said that absolutely should happen. So we will talk to the representatives from that organization, and we will see who is the appropriate person to join this conversation before the next hearing or the next meeting. So I just want to sort of clear that right off the bat. I thought that was a very legitimate point. And again, I think absolutely we should have someone who is from the retirement community formally representing those individuals. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Molly, and then Molly in turn will turn it over to Jomar, and then Jomar will turn it over to our speaker. So Molly?
Thank you, Mayor Barrett. It's an honor to staff this task force. For those who don't know me, I've worked with the city for about 11 years, and I've been the budget analyst assigned to the pension fund for over 6 years. I'm here today to help facilitate this meeting and provide any assistance as necessary. So one quick housekeeping, as Mayor Barrett mentioned, is if you can kindly mute your phone when you're not speaking. And for members of the public, if you would like to share your opinions, and not opinions, but your thoughts and ideas with the task force, please do so by sending an email to pensiontaskforce@milwaukee.gov. And that link will be published shortly. So with no further ado, I'd like to turn this over to Jomar.
Well, thank you, Molly. Good morning, everyone. I'm Jomar Hooper. I'm the Executive Director of Safe and Sound. I'm happy to be helping to lead this vital work for us. Just want to echo the sentiments that the mayor just expressed, that we're kind of at a precipice right now, and this task force has an unenviable job of trying to figure out how we are able to maintain city services and still have a sustainable pension system for our employees as we proceed. So I'm excited for the work to dive in.
I have a microphone, but I don't see where the.
I'm excited for the work to continue, and I'm excited for us to kind of dive in. So I think, Molly, if we could start just by doing some introductions of the group, maybe if you could help by pointing out who's on the group and they can say their name, just a quick 2 seconds about who they represent, then we can go along and jump into the agenda. Molly, I think you're on mute.
Thank you, Jomar. I'd like to start also with Dennis Yacarino. Would you like to start, Dennis?
Sure. I'm Dennis Yacarino. I'm with the city of Milwaukee. I'm in the city budget office.
Aisha Sawa.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Aisha Sava. I'm the city comptroller.
Mark Pelzak.
Good afternoon, everyone. Mark Pelzak. I am Vice President of the American Federation of State, County, and Municipal Employees, AFSCME, Council 32 here in Wisconsin. I'm also a 19-plus year City of Milwaukee employee.
Michael Buongiorno.
Yeah, Mike Buongiorno. I'm the president of Local 215, the Milwaukee Professional Firefighters.
Nicole Fleck.
Hi, Nicole Fleck, labor negotiator for the city. I've worked with the city for 14 years.
Alderman Nick Kovac.
Thank you, Molly. I'm Alderman Nick Kovac, represent the 3rd District of the City of Milwaukee. I'm also a trustee on the Employees Retirement System Board.
Andy Wagner.
Hi, my name is Andy Wagner. I'm the Vice President of the Milwaukee Police Association, representing the same.
Thank you, Andy. Beth Cleary.
Hi, I'm Beth Cleary. Can you hear me? Okay. Beth Cleary, Executive Director with Deferred Compensation Plan 457 Plan. Prior to that, I was Deputy Director with the pension system, and prior to that, I was an Assistant City Attorney. Been with the city for 15 years.
Thank you, Beth. Gina Spang.
Spang, City of Milwaukee resident.
Thank you, Gina. Mr. Jerry Allen. Jerry, you're muted. Jerry, we still can't hear you.
Hi, everybody. I'm Jerry, Executive Director of the Employees Retirement System.
Thank you, Jerry. And Carmelo Patty, I just noticed you've joined us. Can you hear us? Would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure, Carmelo Patty, President of the Milwaukee Police Supervisors Organization. Thank you, city employee since 1993 and with the police department since 1997. Thank you.
Thank you. And along with this, we have Magda. Would you like to introduce yourself for me?
Yes, hi everyone. My name is Magda Fasahaya. I am the Director of the Department of Employee Relations.
We also have the honor of having Mr. Rob Henkin join us today. Mr. Rob, would you like to introduce yourself?
Thanks, Molly. Rob Henkin, I'm the president of the Wisconsin Policy Forum. I'm not a formal member of this task force, but we've done a lot of work around these issues. So I'm here to observe and to hopefully help out if there's any way that we can. Thanks.
Thank you. And we have two honorable speakers today, David Riemer and Mark Nicolini, and I'll turn this over to Joe Marr to do his introduction.
All right, thank you, Molly. As you mentioned, we're the next two guys are going to speak a little bit about some of the key events and just some of where we're at and kind of level set a little bit around our pension and some of our key concerns are David Riemer and Mark Nicolini, two of the foremost experts in county and city pensions who've worked in this field for forever. It feels like for a long time. So we're excited to hear from them and to really understand and dive a little deeper into where we're at with the situation. So I'm going to turn it over to David and Mark at this point.
David, you can go first.
And you're muted.
You're muted.
Can you hear me now? Okay. Well, let me start, I guess, by first introducing myself, and then I'll try to just take a few minutes to give a little background about the global pension settlement that I was involved in. So very briefly, I worked in at City Hall for former Mayor John Norquist for about 13 years. I was budget director, twice administration director, and also the mayor's chief of staff for several years. For most of the time I spent at City Hall, I did not work on pension issues. I'm certainly not an expert on the pension system as a whole. And since I left City Hall in 2002, in other words, for the last 2 decades, I've really not followed pension issues at all, except for what I read in the newspaper or as when Aaron Shapinski called me and asked me if I would be of assistance. But during one of the 2-year period when I was working as administration director, I was part of the city's negotiating team that together with the unions and other parties produced the global settlement, the global pension settlement that was then approved by the members. I gave to Aaron a long list of the names of other people who were part of the city's team. I don't think any are on this call, but there, and I won't go through that entire list, but there are many other people who are still around who are part of that negotiating team. And at some point, you may want to get their insights. It's possible that some of the things that I will be saying out of memory are not quite right. And certainly, I'm happy to be corrected by anybody who knows that anything I say is not quite right. There's 3 things that I want to really talk about during the few minutes that I have here, related to the conditions, the circumstances that produced the global pension settlement. And all 3 of these are ones that today I think it's helpful to be mindful of. The first is that the impetus for the global settlement was a lawsuit that was brought not by unions, at least primarily, but by members of the pension system. And they won their lawsuit. And that's what gave the city a reason to negotiate the pension settlement. That was the primary reason. In the 90s, before those lawsuits were filed, the city had made a decision to begin to use pension fund assets to pay for ERS administrative costs. That is the norm in the pension world, as I understand it, both private and public, that the pension fund, with a small part of its assets, pays for its own administrative costs. But the city hadn't done that. The city instead used property taxes. The decision was made by the mayor and the council, and at least at the time it was made, it wasn't initially controversial to use a portion of the assets of the fund in excess of 100% to pay for administrative costs. Several members of the system went to court claiming that their property rights had been infringed by taking a portion of those assets and using them for administrative costs without their consent. And they won in court. So the city was thus legally obliged either to repay the administrative costs that it had been taking out for several years, as I recall, or to get the consent of not just the members that had sued, but all of the members of the system, both active members who had qualified for benefits and retirees, to get their consent to allow the pension system to pay both retroactively and prospectively for administrative costs. So that was what was driving the city into these negotiations. And the lesson from this, I believe, is that whatever you do, whatever we do, it's really important to pay attention to the legal environment to be sure we don't get tripped up by a successful lawsuit that could unravel what looked like on the merits a perfectly reasonable solution. The second thing I want to draw attention to was the economic context within which that global settlement was negotiated. It was a unique situation that the country was in, and Wisconsin and the city were in. I'm talking about the mid to late 90s. The country was experiencing a huge economic boom, the dot-com boom. The market was going gangbusters. I looked up the Standard & Poor's stock market rate of return index for the 1990 to 2000 period. The average annual rate of return was 16%. The median annual rate of return was 21%. And towards the end of the 90s, which was the period during which the decision that I talked about earlier was made to pay for the pension costs, administrative costs out of the corpus of the fund, and the lawsuit was brought, when the negotiations were taking place, here are the rates of return that S&P says were occurring nationwide, starting from 1995 going to 1999. 37%, 23%, 33%, 28%, and 21%. I'm not sure we've ever seen a string of stock market rates of return at that level. The other thing that's relevant, in addition to this huge boom that was occurring in the markets, was the fact that, looking more deeply into the history of the country's economy, it had not been since the Great Depression that the United States had experienced a very big or long-lasting recession. There were some smaller recessions. A couple of them went over 10% unemployment, but that didn't last very long. So we had this period of 60 years from basically the 30s until the late 90s, when people looked at the economy and assumed it's going to do well. It's always going to do well. We're not going to face major long-term recessions. May not do 20% or 15% every year, but we know how to run our economy to produce generally consistent economic growth. Of course, 10 years after the pension settlement, we ran into the Great Recession. And then 10 years after that, more or less, we ran into what we're now still getting out of, the COVID-19 recession. Two major recessions, bigger than anything that had happened in the prior 60 years, both within a fairly short period. But that was all in the future. No one knew that was looming or likely to happen. So there was a sense of exuberance, a sense of a lot of money in the fund above and beyond 100% full funding. And unions and employees and retirees were looking at that and saying, we want a part of that. And there's a lot to be given because the market's doing really well, way over 100% and getting better. And there was also some discussion in the negotiations that we should assume that the benefits could be increased by very, very large percents. One person referred to a 10% annual rate of increase, because after all, the market was producing 20% rates of return. So all of this created a kind of countervailing incentive on the part of the unions and employees and retirees to want to, if they got a good deal in return, to be willing to negotiate to remove the burden from the city and the taxpayers of having to go back to using property taxes to pay for administrative costs. So those are two things in the background. The lesson from this really is that leads to the third point I want to make. We can't look at the particular experience of the market or the economy in the time we're in, or the few years before, or the next few years, and say it's going to be like this forever. This is the third point, which is the market fluctuates, the stock market fluctuates, the economy fluctuates, and it's important to take that into account. The city, I think the negotiating team made a very wise decision, and I understand it's been followed since then, of using very sophisticated actuarial stochastic modeling in terms of estimating what's going to happen to the pension fund in the future. I had worked for an insurance company before working at City Hall, so I knew what actuaries did, but I never actually heard the term stochastic modeling. I suspect most people on the call know what it is, but I mention it because some of you may not. So it's this system in which you don't just assume an average from the past and project it into the future, but rather you run literally hundreds, sometimes even thousands of different scenarios, assuming all kinds of possible rates of return and so forth. We hired Milliman to do that. And basically, we wanted to be sure that every single possible increase in benefits that was part of a final solution would be using a stochastic model that looks at ups and downs and so forth. It would be one which the stochastic model would show for most scenarios, not 100%, but the overwhelming majority of them. I think we used 85%. That may be wrong, but the overwhelming majority of the scenarios would nonetheless lead to full funding. We assumed that, of course, not knowing that we would be getting two major recessions within 2 decades. So Milliman produced these very sophisticated models, and it may have been that model that they used made assumptions that were too optimistic. But the main point I want to make is that because the market fluctuates so much, because there's so much volatility and randomness from year to year, that it's important to use these sophisticated tools in thinking about any decision about the future of the pension system. That we need to take into account the very best way of looking at the future. It's an impossible task because no one can predict it, but I think stochastic modeling is a very valuable tool. And I'm glad that we did it, even though it obviously didn't produce the perfect outcome that all of us would have wished. So I'll stop at that point, and I'm not sure if you want me to take questions or you want to move on, Joe Marr.
David, I think we do want to open it up to the task force to see if there are any questions for you at this point in time.
And please, anyone who knows.
I have a question for David on behalf of all the task force. Would you define or explain what stochastic model is for us?
Well, sure. I figured that might be the case. So I actually looked at something called Investopedia.com. And they say stochastic modeling is a form of financial modeling that's used to make investment decisions. The type of modeling forecasts the probability of various outcomes under different conditions using random variables. That's the key to it. It presents data and predicts outcomes that account for all kinds of different levels and trends and patterns of unpredictability and randomness. It is inherently random. This is the word that shows up in the definition repeatedly. These uncertainties and randomness are built into the modeling, so it produces all kinds of different estimates. You don't get a single estimate. You get hundreds of them, potentially thousands of them. But then what you can then do is say, which of these are within an X% probability of likelihood? In other words, how many of the models produce the result of full funding, 120% of full funding, 80% of full funding, for example. And the actuaries will come back and say, well, the answer to those questions is, and they'll give you a percent. So it's a good way of assessing risk using this much more sophisticated technique. I know there's others on the call who use this, know it a lot better. So I very much defer to them if they have corrections or any additions. I hope I was close to getting it right.
Well, hi, David. It's Gary Allen, Executive Director for the ERS. You got it right on the button. And you are also correct that we do use this technique for both the actuary uses it for setting the contributions, and our investment committee also uses it in determining the asset allocation. We do an asset liability study every few years, and it does employ this stochastic modeling, and it generates about, in our case, we generate about 2,000 different economic scenarios, and we look at a range of them between the 5th and the 95th percentile. So the really bad ones and the really good ones, but you got it right. So I understand you're a pretty bright fellow and have a degree from a well-known university, so good for you.
And I can pronounce stochastic and even spell it.
That's really good.
Are there any other questions for Mr. Riemer? Well, if not, David's going to be on the call with us, obviously. So if anything comes up or a question throughout the conversation, please feel free to chime in with that either during the presentation or after as well, too. All right, so Molly, I think we're ready to move on for Mark's presentation.
Yes, we are.
Let's make sure, can folks hear me?
Yes, and we're going to toss it over to Mark McNamee, the former budget director, retired budget director for the city of Milwaukee.
Right, thank you very much. I think I sort of feel what Al Pacino's character in The Godfather felt like when he said, keep getting drawn into this. As you mentioned, I did serve as budget director for 13 years, including a fairly tumultuous reversal of the wonderful first decade of the century in terms of investment returns. I also incidentally or coincidentally served in the state budget office for several years, where one of my assignments was the Wisconsin retirement system. So in addition to being both a WRS and CMERS pension recipient, I do have some understanding of some of the formative years of the WRS and how it works that maybe at some point could be of interest. But I'm here on this first presentation simply to respond to a request by Mr. Sapinski to give a little bit of history of how the WRS was formed, the Wisconsin retirement system. And after doing some of the research, I chose this title simply because I learned something I wasn't aware of, that at one time, as the legislature worked through the issue of pensions back in the 20th century, it actually contemplated both the Milwaukee County and the city of Milwaukee retirement systems becoming part of the unified statewide WRS, but that didn't happen. So I guess now we're quite a bit of ways from that, but I thought you might just find that interesting. So why don't we go through quickly. Like I say, what I have to say doesn't really speak a whole lot to any new policy, but there was some interest in how the system got formed, and maybe I can lend a little insight, although I can't answer definitively the question of why the city never did join the WRS. So if you want to help me, Molly, show these slides to the folks, we can get started.
Sure. Can you see my screen, everyone? Presentation?
Yes, we can.
Okay.
I can. I've got my presentation. Now I can. Okay, so anyway, as I mentioned, we can go on. This just, again, responds to a request from the mayor's office. And I was volunteered to do the research. So in terms of the origins of the pensions in Wisconsin, it's somewhat interesting in that the legislature, if you want to move to the next slide, you can. It's somewhat interesting that the legislature's initial focus was actually on the city of Milwaukee. And the first initiative I could locate was way back in 1891, when Jerry was just getting out of high school. It directed the city of Milwaukee to create a pension fund for retired and disabled Milwaukee police and firefighters. And this formed the basis for a couple of funds that we actually worked on in the budget office as they move closer and closer to closing out, those being the Policeman's Annuity and Benefit Fund. I don't know, perhaps some of you remember George Sprague was a key character and leader with that fund, as well as the Fireman's Annuity and Benefit Fund. And both these were established in the early 20s. The first decade also saw creation of pension plans for approximately 60 local and firefighter communities, as well as plans for Milwaukee teachers and a separate plan for non-Milwaukee teachers. And again, periodically other non-teaching employees formed unions of their own, both state and local. So if we look at the next slide, as we move into the 1930s, the wartime and post-war period, I think there you go. One more, two more, I think. We see again some actions specifically affecting Milwaukee. The legislature creating the City of Milwaukee Employees Retirement System, which contained all city employees except teachers. And at the same year anyway, the legislature also created the Milwaukee County Employees Retirement System. One thing I hadn't known until I started doing this research, there was, if you read some of the documents from that period, this joint special legislative committee that was working on pensions actually envisioned the city and county plans would become part of the statewide plan, but as we'll see, that didn't happen. Again, moving on, two other significant events, the formation of the Municipal Employees Retirement Fund, a non-teacher, non-protective service employees fund, and then the Wisconsin State Employees Retirement Fund. And both of these then merged into something called the Wisconsin Retirement Fund. So again, moving again after the war, and in 1945, there was actually a report that this special committee created. It was given the fact that when you think about it, no computers and Remington typewriters and what have you, it was actually a pretty thorough report. They looked at pretty much every significant local and state pension plan that was in existence at the time. And as a result of that, they decided to abandon the notion of incorporating the two Milwaukee plans into a state plan, and in fact granted both Seamers, granted Seamers in 1947 home rule status. They didn't actually grant home rule status to the Milwaukee County plan until 1965. But basically, as home rule really gives a local government complete control over the subject matter for which it's granted home rule, with one glaring exception, which we've learned over the years, other than in matters the legislature has declared to be a statewide concern. But having been granted home rule status, I guess you could say the legislature, in fact, and the city took different forks in the road in terms of WRS creation. By 1975, we had a major merger involving the Wisconsin Retirement Fund, the state teachers, and the Milwaukee teachers into a new entity called the Wisconsin Retirement System. Other than the Milwaukee plans, local police and fire plans merged into the WRS by 1977. As I mentioned, though, a complete statewide consolidation was by then abandoned. I mentioned here, looking at the question was asked, well, why didn't they join? I can't tell you for certain why, but I'm sure there were political considerations. But this special committee was particularly concerned with the Milwaukee plans, not at the time adequately amortizing some of the promised benefits, and also, interestingly, felt that the 4% investment return assumption was much too high that the plans were using at the time. So I guess if maybe history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes with respect to concern about discount rates. Also, I would add that many of these plans we're in effect using the savings plan model, which is kind of a forerunner to what we view as a defined contribution plan, where basically employees and the employer contributed certain set amounts in each pay period, then we're credited with a relatively modest interest rate, and then at the time of retirement, using the mortality tables available at the time, were used to purchase an annuity for the participant. Again, by 1981, we have complete establishment of what we now know as the Wisconsin retirement system. Just one thing again to keep in mind for us Milwaukee folks, if you haven't noted it, Milwaukee teachers remain apart from the ERS, the city's ERS. They're members of the state WRS. Now, there are many Milwaukee Public Schools employees in our city Milwaukee system. These are what are termed the non-certificated employees, folks that don't have a license to teach or a license to be a principal, for example, folks who work in administration, cafeteria service, what have you. They are in the city's pension plan. Just a couple other items to note. The statutes, while we're not exactly kissing cousins, there is some active relationships potentially between the WRS and the city ERS. The statutes do allow both the city and county plans to invest their assets with the Wisconsin Retirement System funds, which are managed through the State of Wisconsin Investment Board. And it's my understanding that has at least been done at some time. I don't know that it's currently going on now. And then about the time actually I left state government for the city, there was legislation. And believe me, Mayor Barrett, I wasn't behind this. There was reciprocity. He likes to kid me about how I get to fix things sometimes. There was reciprocity established, limited reciprocity between Seamers and the WRS that reduced disincentives for a public employee to move from one system to the other. Certainly not full portability, but basically some adjustments to final average salaries that made it somewhat less disadvantageous for an employee to move from one system to the other. And then finally, I did find, and nothing apparently came of this, the Common Council about the time that it was finalizing, the global pension settlement, did appropriate some money to the city attorney to study WRS and Seamers consolidation. But as far as I know, no study was not only never completed, but not even undertaken. So that's my short history of just these two questions. And I would add, for those of you who are looking to get an A in the course, if you want to get the references I used, I'd be glad to provide them to you. You can contact me. But just in summary, in terms of the WRS, it's not a matter of all of a sudden, some point in time, the Wisconsin legislature having a light bulb go off and deciding to create a pension system. It's actually what we know of as the WRS. It's really the product of many mergers and consolidations of predecessor systems over a number of decades. And then, as I mentioned, at one time they had the vision of Milwaukee being part of this, but with the exception of the teachers, the two other Milwaukee plans were carved out and ran at home rule status. So that's really where we sit today with respect to the relationship to the Wisconsin retirement system. So thank you for your patience. Hope my voice hasn't been too scratchy. And again, if you want any now or later, any follow-up, I'd be glad to try to provide it. So thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Are there any questions for Mr. Nicolini from the group?
I actually, Joe, I have a question. This is Tom Barrett. Mark, is it your sense, and maybe you can't tell us, the fact that they were potentially dancing with each other? When I say dancing, that during the course of these conversations about mergers and consolidations, that the city of Milwaukee and Milwaukee County did not become part of this? Was it because the city and county rejected the notion, or was it the state legislature that rejected the notion? Do you have a sense of that, or is that just speculation at this stage?
You know, to be honest, I could probably only speculate, but I get a sense just by, should I say, some of the terminology and the tone of this report. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, because I'm losing I'm losing the presentation. I may have to get back. You may have to give me a minute. But I get a sense from the report, just this terminology, that the legislative committee really was not very impressed with the way Milwaukee systems were being run. Felt there was undue political influence. And again, the aforementioned concerns about the actual financing of the plans. So, and I think Milwaukee perhaps, when, again, I don't know how it was offered, but I think it perhaps viewed being able to run its own affairs as attractive, and maybe didn't fight that hard to get into the system. But that's more speculation. Did I come through?
Mark, this is Jerry Allen. I want to add something to that. Of course, I wasn't on the scene at that time, but I would like to note that under the law of trust, it's the obligation of the pension fiduciaries to look out solely for the interests of their members and beneficiaries. And so it's risky and not necessarily in the interest of one set of beneficiaries to add another set of beneficiaries if those plans are not funded about the same, because you end up watering down the benefit security of one group to benefit the other. And so that's probably one of the things they considered when you mentioned that they were concerned about the financing.
Right. I know there was some specific reference to some improvements that have been made relative to benefits and not having been funded at all. And so, again, my guess is that there was a good deal of concern from the legislature. Although they did bring in a couple small state plans that were also viewed as not particularly healthy in terms of their finance. For example, the conservation wardens came in for a lot of criticism, but that was a much, much smaller plan than either the county or the city ERS plans. So that's, again, not necessarily any great revealing information there, but for those of you interested on perhaps why it didn't happen or how the WRS was formed, you got a little bit of information there.
Any additional questions for Mark about this portion of the presentation? All right, I think we can go ahead and proceed into the rest of the presentation.
Okay, I guess you may occasionally want to let me know, if you're hearing me, because all I've got, I've lost, contact with you guys.
Yeah, you come through loud and clear, Mark.
I can hear you, so I won't be following, the pace of the slides, but I certainly don't have any trouble doing that on my own. And Molly can bring them up as she kind of senses I'm moving from one slide to another. So again, just occasionally say gotcha or something. I want to make sure I'm not out of the presentation without knowing it. So I was asked by, again, Mr. Sapinski to come up with some important financial milestones that have occurred post-global pension settlement with regard to the financing and funding of the City of Milwaukee Employees Retirement System. So the goal here is to summarize those, talk about the impact on city contributions, which again, I don't want to ignore by any means our brothers and sisters in the city agencies, but the city government accounts for 81% of the contributions. And really the challenge, I think, is certainly more stark for city government than what these other agencies may be facing with respect to funding the system. I did want to add, I'm a veteran of the 1980-81 recession, which I don't think was left out. So I just wanted to bring that one up. The city dealt with some of the impacts of that with an adjustment to pensions for people already tired, which was much less ambitious than the global pension settlement, but did help some who had been ravaged by the very high inflation that occurred throughout the 1970s and the first couple of years of the 80s. So, can you hear me? Because I've got no idea whether you guys can hear me or not, unless you say something.
Yeah, we hear you, Mark.
Okay, sorry. Okay. So in terms of timing, this perhaps helps to know that like city government, but not all the city agencies, Riemer's finance runs on a January to December fiscal year. And like most defined benefit systems, there's 3 funding sources. You have investment return, which generally can account for 75 to 80% of the funding of the system, employee contributions, and then the residual, which funds what the actuary says is still needed, are the employer contributions. And the annual valuation is what drives the financing requirements, linking all these pieces together. There is some lag, at least for city government, built into the system. And I will add, we've kind of addressed that partially through one of our innovations that saved the taxpayers a very meaningful amount of money. But the employee contributions, in terms of the law, are due January 31st in the year following the valuation. So in other words, you've got 2008 experience drives the 2009 valuation, which then drives the contribution that's due January the following year. And so, as I mentioned, this does have some implications for interest cost. If an Army runs on its stomach, defined benefit pension plans tend to run on interest. And so that's something we tried to address and did address a few years later, which you'll see. You can move on to the next slide. So what happened when we hit 2010? With what we saw as a drastic, almost 32% decline in the CMERS market returns in 2008. By way of background, there had been no employer contributions required going back to 1996 through 2009, and even if we did not have a full funding limit in place at the time, which was a prohibition against making employer contributions if the fund was 102% or more funded. The actuary actually said even if that had not been in place, contributions would have been required because there was so much funded surplus at the time during these years. So anyway, what we were hit with, and as the mayor mentioned, going from 0 to a much higher number very quickly. For city government, it was 49 million. I won't mention all these numbers each year, but really, when you think about it, I think at the time the total levy was about 220 million, and we went from using 0 of that for employer contributions to almost 50 million. The board did some things in terms of its funding techniques just to smooth out the effect of asset changes, a longer amortization period, which we offset, if you will, through a compromise by closing the amortization window, going down 1 year each year, and adopting a level percent of payroll target. And this was codified in the city charter in May of 2010, an interest in trying to make the some of the funding techniques, both more mainstream but also more knowable, so that wouldn't be subject potentially to yearly changes. I should add one other factor that was built into the system for quite some time was the notion that while we have employee contributions, and historically they've been 5.5% for general city employees, 7% for firefighters and police officers, as well as elected officials. As a result of legislation and collective bargaining, the employer had been picking up what we call the employee contribution. However, as a result of bargaining, this was ended for new employees hired on or after January 1st of 2010. And this was prior, to the legislature's Act 10. Moving ahead a couple of years, Molly, to 2011, 2012, which were notable, I guess you might say, for, I think, some very effective collaboration between the mayor and the common council, as well as the budget office. Because of the strength of investment return in prior years and a return to a solid 2009 return, there were no contributions required in 2011, 2012. However, as Mr. Riemer mentioned, the budget office, with the cooperation of Mr. Langer, the principal actuary at the time, had at its disposal a forecasting system, and we saw basically under most likely circumstances contributions needed for 2013 and beyond. So the mayor and the common council used, in effect, if you will, I don't want to call it surplus, but funds that were no longer needed for that $47 million contribution. Over 2 years, they placed a total of more than 44 million into what's called the employer's reserve, which is available for use in future years to help with pension funding requirements. I will add one other thing. I mentioned Act 10. When that came along, there was a prohibition in the legislation against the employer picking up the employee contribution for non-public safety employees. However, this, regardless of their hire date. However, the city attorney at the time, with the council's approval, filed a lawsuit regarding this, and as we'll see, it eventually was settled, but it put on hold one of the ramifications of Act 10. So after we have the 2 salad years, I guess, if you will, although by no means were they wild spending years, but we avoided major cuts. I guess I should add the 2010 budget, among other things, cut something like 350 funded positions, including public safety positions. So the city's never been hesitant about taking action, even difficult actions, in meeting the pension challenge. I mentioned at the top of this, and this is what really one of the bugaboos of finding any solution has been the state policy regarding shared revenue, which for many, many years was the city's primary revenue source. By statute, had to increase by at least 5% every year. But by the middle of the first decade, that state policy started deteriorating, and the city actually received either freezes or actual cuts in its shared revenue payment for many years. And by 2013, the inflation-adjusted impact of that was almost $80 million. And again, when you're dealing with a budget that's very much prone to inflation, including mandated arbitration requirements, which generally build in inflation as the floor, in many cases for wage settlements, it makes it very difficult not to have that ongoing increase in shared revenue. As a result, though, of some of these difficulties, effective for 2014, a second tier of benefits was established for general city employees, again, hired on or after January 1, 2014, which increased normal retirement ages, as well as the 30-year window, lowered the multiplier to 1.6%, delayed the post-retirement escalator to 5 after 5 years instead of after 2, and because it was a less costly system in terms of normal cost, the employee's contribution, which the employee would have to make on their own, was reduced from 5.5% to 4%. And this, at the time, was estimated to reduce pension liabilities by about $93 million over 20 years, compared to had the pre-existing benefit levels increased. And one thing I think it's interesting to point out is, and it relates very much to our challenge today, while $93 million certainly is no small beer, it shows you that it's very difficult to unravel our current challenge just by looking at future employees, because really the difficulty lies in unfunded prior service liability. And so it's really much more difficult to get at that. Moving on to the next slide. One thing I think Mr. Yacarino and probably Mr. Riemer could certainly attest to this. When it comes to budgeting for employer contributions, certainly we always like to see less rather than more, but there's also a real interest in having some certainty and predictability of what contributions are going to be, because we like to at least lay out a 3 or 4 year plan when we do the budget. And when you have such a large expenditure subject to a lot of variability, that can be quite difficult. So really the key goal was to reduce under a typical process. The valuation each year results in a new and revised contribution. And again, given as Mr. Riemer pointed out, the great volatility that can occur in pension return, this can really drive contribution requirements up and down quite a bit from one year to another. So in order to get around that problem of variability, the city worked with the actuary, came up with a plan that met his blessing, met his standards for actuarial soundness, and as you see, included several important features, one of which, probably the most important of which, is that the employer would now pay the normal cost regardless of the funded status. And in terms of planning for budget requirements, stable contribution would have percentages in place for each employee category for 5 years, and you see those at the bottom of the slide. These were the first set of contribution percentages, and I should add that these include both the normal cost as well as at the time what was felt was an amount necessary to make progress on reducing unfunded liability. So did that come through okay, Jomar?
We can definitely hear you. Yes, we can.
Okay. Yeah, seems this is really quite a system, I'll tell you. I feel like I'm announcing a recreated baseball game or something. So moving to slide 8, we had more funding innovations and policy changes. One thing I had mentioned earlier, maybe this is a little inside baseball to some folks, but the city, being on a calendar year budget, was always paying whatever the discount rate and interest was for being in effect a year late. Not a year late, I shouldn't say that, but by making the payment a year in the year after the valuation actually was pertinent to. So we decided to do, since interest rates were so low, some short-term borrowing to basically pay off this amount. We weren't able to get generally the full 12 months, but we generally got about 11 months earlier than required, which saved us typically, as I recall, something over $4 million a year budgetarily. And that was, didn't have any effect on anybody's benefits or meeting our contribution obligations, but simply was a a smart way to use low interest rates to our advantage. And I thank certainly Dennis for his help on implementing that. We mentioned some drama going on in the illegal arena. On July 31st of 2014, the Supreme Court, made a decision declaring that in fact employee contributions in the city of Milwaukee are a matter of statewide concern. And so that basically affirmed the Act 10 prohibitions of the employer pickup for general employees. And so all general employees in the city, regardless of their hire date, began paying that contribution, I believe in 2015, which generated about $7.5 million of savings. And again, by 2015, the beat goes on, almost 500 funded positions now have been cut since 2010 in response, as well as many cost-saving measures in the healthcare plan. And as you see, more sharing by employees for the actual financing of the plan. Moving to slide 9, I guess a short slide. Again, I guess my history with the plan has been one of promise and then disappointment in terms of its financing. It seems we hit a period where we're looking good for a while, and then some wrench comes in to make things more difficult. But as you see, the friends at the Public Policy Forum noted the progress the city had been making since its last report in 2009 on the city's fiscal condition. We certainly thank them for their insights and honest opinions on how we were doing during that time. As you see, the city was able to avoid any use of its pension reserve. The employee healthcare budget was down about $32 million compared to 2011. But even with all those favorable events, the mayor still felt a need to propose a sales tax for the city because by then our shortfall, if you will, in shared revenue had reached more than $100 million in inflation-adjusted terms. So I'll try to close this out quickly now because I know I'm probably exhausting my time. But again, as I mentioned, the big challenge is really started to emerge once again by 2018. The board does a new 5-year experience study as required by charter, and they established new stable contribution rates, which really were quite similar to those that have been established in the first go round. However, the return assumption was reduced from 8.25% to 8%, which, while it presented challenges, was something we were more or less ready to deal with. But then after the experience study was completed, the following year, the board revised its investment return assumption to 7.5%, which is being used now for valuation purposes. However, it does not affect the stable contribution set up until 2023. And as you see, the new contribution rates are really quite starkly higher than what we're dealing with for the 2018 to 2022 period. I guess you could say almost double, more or less, in each of the 3 cases. And again, that's against the payroll for each of these employee groups. So what does that mean for what I call the unsustainable future, which it certainly is? Current conditions aren't going to be sustained. We're looking at the potential of $150 million contribution. And I believe this is city only, is it not, Dennis?
Yes, that's city owned.
Right. And then up to $163 million by 2027. And that compares to about $71 million forecast for 2020 and 2021. There is $42 million still residing in the pension reserve. The mayor and the common council merit a lot of credit for managing the reserve along with Mr. Iaccarino guarding it like somewhat of a mother hen. But again, 42 million kind of pales in comparison to what the challenge is going to be. The way I think, just by pure arithmetic, simple arithmetic, either they're going to have to reduce services drastically or come up with a new approach to the contribution, unless I guess the third wheel of some major new revenue infusion comes to fruition. But I'm certainly not banking on that. I do want to add the city is taking action, not always politically popular, to utilize really its relatively limited revenue alternatives. Most of those are in the area of user charges. And again, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention state fiscal policy, at least currently, offers absolutely no relief in terms of the city's budget in general or the pension plan in particular. A couple strong notes, though, to keep in mind. Our funded ratio at the market basis using the 7.5% discount rate is 84%, which I imagine would still rank quite high relative to most other public systems. And our market value of over $5.5 billion is equivalent to, I think, something like 11 or 12 years of payroll. One thing that's often forgotten is in the midst of all this, and I should have made a note of it, good years and bad years, obviously no obligations were missed. And Jerry, I think we're probably at almost since 2009, 2010, probably the system has paid out more than $3 billion. And
that's correct. And that's correct. We paid out more money since then than we had at the time.
Right. So that's quite notable. And then finally, I think something you'll find interesting, and really the reason we're able to recover reasonably well in terms of the plan condition from that tough 2008 year, you'll see real strong investment performance has been the story for the most part through 2020. So that's what I have. And again, I think people will have available my contact information if they have any questions about the data or documentation used for this report.
Thank you very much for the presentation, Mark, and for the information. I think this is it's good for us to level set, and I'm curious if there's any questions from the task force. And if there's not, I have one to kind of start us off with. I'm just curious about some context, and maybe Mark, I'm not sure if you have the answer to this, or maybe if Rob or Jerry want to chime in. But I'm just curious as far as the situation that we're in with our pension being funded in the mid 80%. How are our contributions looking compared to other similar cities at this point in time? Are there actuarial kind of assumptions similar to ours, and are they paying similar amounts into their pension funds on an annual basis? Rob?
Well, I think, go ahead, Rob.
Jomar, I can't answer the second part of your question, which is what other annual taxpayer contributions look like. But I can tell you that as of a couple of years ago, when we worked with Pew on a similar task force for Milwaukee County, 80% is at that time, and again, a lot has happened since that time, but 80% was certainly respectable. I think that, clearly there were, lots of state plans in the 40s and 50s. So again, respectable, not fantastic, obviously. And that was as of a couple of years ago.
Yeah, I haven't done any comprehensive look, Jomar. Seems just based on the newspapers I read, Chicago, I mean, it's just, all their systems are, from what I understand, in very difficult straits. Philadelphia systems, same would go for them. I think there's been a lot of pushback, even in California, from the base to the decisions to lower discount rates, but I can't really tell you what exactly has been proposed, say, as alternatives. But I can tell you this is, in most systems, other than perhaps the Wisconsin retirement system. I think it remains a very difficult issue.
All right, thank you, Mark and Rob.
This is Carmelo. This is for either maybe Mark or Dennis or Jerry. Compared to the discount rate when you had it up on the slide at 8.25% to 8% when it was reduced to the now 7.5%, where does that lie in comparison to peers at the 7.5%? Thank you.
Thanks for the question, Carmelo. It's an excellent question. As it turns out, we're going to have a board meeting on Monday, of course, and the actuary, I don't think he'll present at this board meeting, but he in the last time we had the discussion about the discount rate a couple years ago, he uses a survey of public funds. It's called the Horizon Survey. And so the reality is that most of the discount rates in the public sector are moving lower towards 7 and even below 7%. The Wisconsin retirement system, I believe, is at 7% for active employees. And they use a very low rate for the retirees, 5.5. It's one of the lowest I've seen. But there are many other public systems that are moving, again, towards 7% or even below. That's the trend today.
Thank you, appreciate that.
Additional questions?
Oh, I want to add one thing about that. Not everybody may be familiar with the term discount rate. The discount rate is really the same thing as the expected return, the average assumed return over a 30-year period for a pension system. And it is, in fact, the yardstick that's used for measuring the liabilities and determining the employer contribution. So the discount rate or the assumed rate of return is a key metric for any pension system. And that's, I'm sure, why Carmelo is asking the question.
And Jerry, while you're on that topic, if you could maybe explain for folks who are listening as well too. I know Mark mentioned it, but maybe go into more detail about what is our methodology for smoothing and our amortization period right now.
Okay, smoothing, almost 80% of public pension plans use 5-year smoothing of assets, so that they're not taking a snapshot on the last day of the year, because that doesn't reflect anything other than what happened at that moment in time, right? So in order to, the actuary is looking for for funding purposes, is looking for a representative of asset value. And so we smooth over 5 years. And that's, as I said, it's typical. It's 80% of the public plans. The last survey I saw do that. And then amortization is another question. Our amortization is a little complicated, but generally speaking, every 5 years we have to do what we call an experience study. The actuary does an experience study, and we reset all of the economic and demographic assumptions for our plan. And so if there's actuarial gains or losses, amortization is a concept, is like a mortgage, okay? So in the context of an actuarial loss, if people retire sooner than we expect, or the investment results aren't as good as we expect, or if mortality is if people are living longer than expected, then those create actuarial losses, and they have to be financed over time, like a mortgage. It's a thing. So we use, when we reset our experience after 5 years, we use a 25-year amortization period. Actuarial standards of practice allow up to 30 years. The last time we did this was a couple of years ago, so we're now down to about our unfunded liability, which is about $1.3 billion. We got about 23 years left to pay it off. Okay, so that's the main provision. There's a secondary provision. In between the 5-year studies, every year we still do evaluation, even though we have a stable contribution that's only set every 5 years. So there are annual actuarial gains and losses, and those get amortized for 15 years. So we ended up having a whole portfolio of amortization schedules in between the 5 years, and then when they get set, the actuary, if there's any losses due to changes in assumptions, then that's amortized over 25 years. So that's kind of complicated, but it's typical for public pension plans to use 25 to 30 years on an ongoing plan. If you close a plan, then the actuarial profession is going to make you use something more like 10 years. So you have to pay off those debts quickly if you close a plan. The principle involved in that case is a simple one. You know, when you leave the restaurant, you have to pay your dinner bill. So that's why when you close a plan, you end up, there's a shorter period for the benefits to be paid off, and the actuarial the duration of the liability is shorter, to use a technical term. So they require that you pay it off faster. But an ongoing plan, such as we have, it's we're going to be at about 25 years. I hope that addresses it without too much complexity. I'm sorry for the complexity.
It's a complex issue, Jerry. No worries. Thank you. Just want to give the floor to the task force again if there's any additional questions. All right. Well, if not, Molly, I think maybe we can start to talk about what meeting number 2 is going to look like. And if there's any additional topics or things that the group would like to, I know we already have a little bit of a plan as far as what that looks like, but if there's any additional topics that we want to add to that as well.
Yes, we can do that. Definitely do that. Jomar, I just want to remind that everyone in attendance are welcome to, email their suggestions in, and any questions they had pertaining to any one of these presentations or anything that was discussed today, to please email it to pensiontaskforce@milwaukee.gov.
Thank you, Molly. And definitely take, there was some pre-reading as well too, and that the administration sent over. So if there's any questions that arise through that, as well as the presentations today, which will be shared out to the group as well too, Molly?
Yeah.
Okay. Well then
definitely. Jerry Ellen, I wanted to mention one other thing for the members of the task force. As you all know, Molly has set up, and Aaron set up a Dropbox where we can deposit documents and articles and things like that. So just because Mark talked about, comparisons with the WRS and a long history between the two plans, we put together a couple of slides that shows a comparison between the investment return between the two systems. And you'll see it's out there. It actually looks like a hand in a glove. It's very much, very, very, very similar. And the performance is measured from 2000 to 2021. So it's 21 years. It's a good long time period because we're both plans are long-term investors. But there's other things out there on that Dropbox if people want to look at it. I think you'll find most of those documents to be of real interest. Thank you, Molly, for assisting in that.
Yep. And again, if anyone cannot access the Dropbox and needs some assistance, I'd be happy to send a copy or attachments to their email. So please let me know. And one point I want to mention that Jerry alluded to, he did provide us a copy of Chapter 36 and some of the rules that governs everything we do and can't do. So that's also in there.
Yeah. The other thing that will be on there on Monday, as I mentioned, the ERS board is meeting on Monday to receive and hopefully approve the 2021 actuarial evaluation and a presentation by the actuary. Everybody that's on this call it's a public meeting. They're all welcome. Dial in, and there's a link on our website for that. But after the board receives and approves those reports, I will put them in the Dropbox as well for the trustees, so you can see what the results are. The funded ratio is pretty much in the 80% range again, so no big change there.
Great. And I would also ask too, if there's any items that we need as far as a group or to help make our decision-making processes and our knowledge base a little stronger too. Just I would also drop that to Molly as well, so that we can see if there's any additional research that needs to take place in between now and meeting number 2. Well, good. Well, Molly, I think we can, we're a little bit ahead of schedule, and I think we can get some time back and go ahead and adjourn. I don't know if you or the mayor have anything to say at the conclusion of this.
I'll jump in here. I want to thank both David and Mark for really, really good presentations. And I think, as everyone can recognize, we've got a challenge, a very serious challenge ahead of us. I think Carmelo's question captured it as well as anybody in terms of the return rate. You can see what happened with the projected increase for next year, with the decision to move the discount rate from 8.0 to 7.5. So if we went lower than that, what would be the impact on the amount we pay and current services and current liabilities? If we don't do that, are we being responsible stewards? I think we also can recognize, or must recognize, the state has not been particularly sympathetic to our plight on this thing. So we have a lot of work to do. So it's my hope next time that we'll have Pew with us to look at some things. I think that's important. I'm going to ask Rob Henkin to give his reaction right now, and then we'll turn over to Molly to take us home. Rob, what's your reaction?
Thanks, Mayor. Well, again, I had the opportunity to work with Pew and to facilitate a similar task force for the county a few years ago. And, I think at that point in time, that task force was very eager to consider whether there were some really dramatic design changes to the county plan that could address the issue of the unfunded liability and the county contributions required to take care of that liability. And unfortunately, the answer to that question turned out to be no, that plan design changes, changing from defined benefit to defined contribution, looking at hybrid approaches, et cetera, potentially over the real long term would produce some savings for the government. But over the short term, in many ways, and also folding into WRS was also considered as a major redesign change. For the short term, it wasn't going to solve the fiscal problem. So I think part of the issue for this task force is, what are you trying to solve for? If X here is we can't afford $150 million per year, we have to do something to make that change. It doesn't mean that big design changes shouldn't be considered, but it means that that's when you maybe have to look at benefit changes, and that's when you run into, of course, legal as well as fairness issues to do that. So I wish that I could say, yeah, you have a whole bunch of relatively easy options here. You don't, but you probably didn't need to have me say that. But I think just sort of thinking of it that way, plan design changes, benefit changes, are there mixes? Also, are there accounting changes? And clearly you don't want to do anything irresponsible, but given the fiscal situation you're in, you at least have to be consider whether there are changes in that regard. My sense is that maybe you'll have to go into all three buckets to try to get the type of outcomes you're looking for.
Thanks, Rob. All right, Molly, you want to bring us home?
Sure. Well, Mayor, I want to echo the mayor's sentiment. Thank you so much, David Riemer, Mark Nicolini, for your presentation today, and for all the members of this task force. Thank you so much for your time and effort and devotion to this task at hand. So our next meeting will be the week of July 5th, and we're basically going to go about the background of local and national outlook, best practices for managing fund. And as Mayor alluded to, Rob Henkin will provide us with discussion on his output with two charitable trust, his research he's done with them. He'll provide us an insight on that, and we'll call members submission for providing us some feedbacks and some suggestions that the members of this group has to provide us by July 16th. This is what the goal is at this point. So if you have any suggestions, again, share with us. I'll put it in the Dropbox so the mayor and Aaron Chapinski can review those. So look forward to our invite for week of July 5th. It's coming. And that's all I have. Jomar, thank you for vice chairing this meeting today.
Great job, Jomar. Great job.
Yes.
Thank you all. Well, everyone have a great weekend. And Molly, thank you for your support to the task force as well.
Thanks.
All right, take care.
Bye, everyone.